Rian Johnson's deliciously twisted whodunit Knives Out is finally, well, out. Even if you paid close attention all throughout the hilarious caper, you may be left with some questions. We're here to lay out everything you need to know about the ending and what really happened to Harlan Thrombey. To understand the ending of Knives Out, it's important to first understand each character in the film's sprawling cast and how they're all connected to one another. At the top of the family tree is Harlan's wizened mother, Ana Juanetta, who doesn't say much but sees a lot. And then there's Harlan and his two surviving children, Linda and Walt. Walt ostensibly runs Harlan's publishing house, while Linda is a self-made businesswoman who built her business from the ground up.
Hi, I'm Walt Thrombey. And if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because you know my dad.
In reality, Harlan is still the one pulling the strings, and Linda got her start with a handy $1 million startup loan from her father. Of course. Beyond them, there's Joni, an Instagram influencer whose husband, Harlan's son, died 15 years earlier. She's been living off of Harlan's generosity ever since. Linda is married to Richard, and they have an adult son, Hugh, although the family calls him by his middle name, Ransom. Walt is married to Donna, and they have a teenage son, Jacob. And Joni has a college-age daughter, Meg, from a marriage to Harlan's son. Also in the Thrombeys family orbit are Harlan's housekeeper, Fran, and his personal nurse, Marta, who also became his close friend and confidant. Although the Thrombeys often say they consider Marta part of the family, a claim that's constantly undermined by their ability to remember what country she's from, the only one she's really close to other than Harlan is Meg. Harlan's housekeeper Fran discovers him dead on the couch in his study, covered in blood from a knife wound to the neck, apparently self-inflicted. His family had all come into town for his 85th birthday party the night before, and they wind up sticking around for the funeral, will reading, and police investigation. Although Lieutenant Elliot, the investigator assigned to the case, believes Harlan clearly killed himself, he still covers his bases by questioning everyone. Conversely, renowned private investigator Benoit Blanc suspects foul play right from the get-go.
I suspect foul play. I have eliminated no suspects.
Technically, Blanc turns out to be only partially right. No one killed Harlan Thrombey. He really did do the deed himself by slitting his own throat. But the actual circumstances surrounding his death were far more complicated than that. Early on, we get Marta's version of the events that led to Harlan's death, which caused her to believe that she killed him. After Harlan's birthday party, Marta accompanied him up to his study, where they played their nightly round of the board game Go, which Marta always won, and she gave him his evening medication. Occasionally, Marta would follow up his daily meds with 3 milligrams of morphine, which Harlan referred to as the good stuff, to help with the pain he'd been suffering since a recent surgery. Since it was Harlan's birthday, Marta thought he'd earned a dose of the good stuff to help him sleep, and when she went to pick up the vial of morphine, she realized the bottles had been switched. She had already given Harlan 100 milligrams, a lethal dose. Marta searched for the antagonist that would counteract the overdose, but it was missing. She tried to call 911, but Harlan stopped her, knowing the ambulance wouldn't arrive in time, and not wanting Marta to face scrutiny that would lead to her undocumented mother being deported. Instead, before the morphine kicked in, Harlan walked Marta through an elaborate plan to keep her above suspicion. While Marta's version of events was the truth, it wasn't the whole truth. It turned out that Harlan's grandson, Ransom, had switched out the morphine with Harlan's other meds earlier in the evening, intending for Marta to administer the overdose of morphine while thinking it was his regular medication. However, Ransom failed to take into account Marta's professional expertise and familiarity with Harlan's evening routine, not to mention Harlan's own tendency to be a sore loser, all of which caused his plan to go sideways. Earlier in the evening, after Marta had set out all of Harlan's medication beside the Go board, she beat Harlan at the game yet again. Harlan knew she could beat him nearly every time, yet still was convinced each time they played that this time he'd finally win. When Marta won, Harlan overturned the game board, sending his medication tumbling onto the floor with the Go pieces. When Marta retrieved the vials from the floor, she didn't even look at the labels, instead relying on her familiarity with what the bottle's contents looked like. So when she gave Harlan 100 milligrams of the drug in the bottle labeled morphine, she was actually giving him the correct medication, which means that if he'd allowed her to call the ambulance like she'd wanted, instead of taking matters into his own hands, he would have been just fine. After financially supporting his family for years, Harlan had come to the conclusion that their financial dependence on him wasn't doing any of them any favors. They'd all grown accustomed to the indulgent lifestyle that Harlan's wealth afforded them, and had convinced themselves that they deserved it, even though they'd done nothing to earn it. Hoping to motivate them all to go make something of themselves, Harlan had decided to cut off their access to his fortune, instead naming Marta as his sole beneficiary. When Harlan turns up dead, multiple characters begin referring to something called the Slayer Rule, as a way to circumvent Harlan's wishes and allow his family to inherit his estate. Despite its dramatic name, the Slayer Rule is actually a real thing, stating that a killer cannot inherit the property of their victim. Harlan left his entire estate to Marta, but if the family could prove that she killed him, it would void his will.
Did you just Google that?
I did just Google that.
What's more, the Slayer Rule applies to civil, not criminal law. This means that Marta wouldn't actually have to be convicted of Harlan's death for the Thornbys to gain access to Harlan's money. All Ransom has to do in order to reclaim his inheritance is amass enough evidence against Marta to file a wrongful death claim, a much lower bar to clear than having to convince a jury of her guilt. The mystery of who hired Blanc simmers throughout Knives Out, and not even Blanc himself knows who his employer is until the end of the film. He was hired with nothing more than an envelope full of cash and a newspaper clipping of Harlan's death, which was enough to pique his interest. It seems strange that someone would hire a private investigator to dig into Harlan's death, especially since the only person who seems to know the full circumstances around Thornby's death is Marta, who has a vested interest in no one finding out the truth.
CSI KFC?
It turns out that Ransom was the one who sent Blanc the cash and the newspaper clipping, hoping that he would discover that Marta had given Harlan a lethal dose of morphine, which would trigger the Slayer Rule and prevent her from inheriting his estate. But of course, things don't wind up going according to Ransom's plan. Ransom was the only family member to learn what Harlan was planning for his estate. And from his time as Harlan's research assistant, he also knew about the Slayer Rule, which led to him hatching his plan. If he could make a case for Marta having killed Harlan, then she wouldn't be able to inherit, allowing him to get the money he felt he was owed. Ransom switched the medications in Marta's medical bag and removed the antidote that could counteract the morphine, thinking that when Harlan died of an overdose, it would obviously point to Marta. But when Harlan slit his throat, Ransom needed someone to make a more thorough investigation, which is why he hired Blanc. When he realized that Harlan didn't overdose after all, Ransom changed tactics again, destroying the autopsy records and endearing himself to Marta so that she'd give him his share of the money. But when Fran attempted to blackmail him, Ransom changed his plan yet again, intending to kill Fran and frame Marta for her death instead of Harlan's. Since the Thornbys opted to not invite the help to Harlan's funeral, Fran the housekeeper was still at home when Ransom sneaked into the house to replace the medications he'd tampered with in Marta's medical bag. Fran had never liked Ransom and grew immediately suspicious that he'd done something shady. She contacted her cousin in the medical examiner's office and got a copy of the toxicology report from Harlan's autopsy, which she didn't know how to interpret but assumed it said something to incriminate Ransom. Fran made a copy of the report's header, storing the original in the same clock where she hid her marijuana, the stash she sometimes shared with Marta and Meg, and sent it to Ransom with the note, "I know what you did," along with a meeting time and place where she intended to confront him. Ransom in turn sent the note along to Marta, giving her a slightly later meeting time, intending for her to show up as Fran died, so that Marta would get arrested for killing Fran. When Ransom met Fran, he attacked her and injected her with morphine, leaving her for dead. But she's still alive when Marta arrives, and manages to gasp out that the toxicology report was with her stash, and that "you did this." Despite confusing this statement for an accusatory "you did this," Marta nevertheless tries to save Fran by calling 911 and administering CPR. Fran eventually dies in the hospital, leading to Ransom being arrested for her death. Blanc can tell from the first instant he meets Marta that she knows more about Harlan's death than she's letting on, due to a small spatter of blood on her white shoes.
None of them are murderers.
We'll find out.
When Marta finally comes clean to Blanc after trying to save Fran, he thinks he has all the pieces, but it isn't until he reads the toxicology report that Blanc finally realizes what happened and who is to blame. He realizes the second he looks at it that Harlan hadn't suffered an overdose, that someone must have intentionally switched Harlan's medications, and based on the events of the night of Harlan's party, he knows it must have been Ransom. While his suspicions may not have been enough to get Ransom convicted, it turns out that Marta tricked Ransom by telling him Fran was alive, prompting Ransom to brag to Blanc that he'd gotten away with everything. But unbeknownst to Ransom, Marta was lying, and managed to hold off her regurgitation reflex just long enough for Trooper Wagner to record Ransom's entire confession. After spending the entire film in a constant state of panic, Marta is able to rest easy at the end, knowing that nothing she did led to Harlan's death and that she helped the police find the person truly responsible for what happened to him. Marta's lack of culpability in Harlan's death means that the Thornby family has no grounds on which to contest Harlan's will, allowing Marta to claim her entire inheritance, which consists of the publishing house, the mansion, the rights to all of Harlan's written works, and $60 million. We last see her sipping from a mug that says, "My house, my rules, my coffee," first seen way back in the opening shot of the film, standing over the rest of the Thornby family on the mansion's balcony. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more Uber videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and to the bell so you don't miss a single one.